Indianapolis, 1912. A haze of cigar smoke curls through a second-floor room above Washington Street. Around a heavy oak table sit some of the most powerful men in America's young automobile industry. Henry Joy of Packard, Frank Seiberling of Goodyear, and their restless host, Carl Fisher. Outside, wagons clatter down muddy streets. Inside, Fisher is talking about a road that no one has ever seen. He slams his palm on a stack of maps and says, "A rock highway from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Boys, let's build it before we're too old to enjoy it." The room falls quiet. It's not a sales pitch, it's a dare. In an age where most Americans had never ventured more than a few miles away from home, Fisher is proposing to connect a continent with concrete. Around the table, the men exchange looks, somewhere between disbelief and awe. They know what this could mean. Cars in every driveway, towns linked by commerce, and a nation finally tied together by something more than rails. That meeting, half dream, half declaration, would become the spark for the Lincoln Highway, America's first transcontinental road. But to understand how Fisher's impossible idea took hold, we have to step back into a country where the open road was still a muddy mess. Well, today we get to talk about the first road to try to bind us coast to coast and everything in between. This is the birth of the Lincoln Highway as we go beyond the exit. A nation stuck in the mud. Before that night in Indianapolis, America's roads were in crisis. Beyond the cities, most were little more than dirt and ruts, often impassable after a rain. Local townships were responsible for maintenance, and few had the money or authority to do more than patch what the weather destroyed. Out of more than 2 million miles of rural road, fewer than 1 in 10 had any improved surface at all. Automobiles, still a relatively new curiosity, were outrunning the nation's infrastructure. It was in this setting that the small group of early industrialists began to talk about a road that could span the continent. Among them was Carl Graham Fisher, co-founder of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the Press-to-Light Light Company, not to mention one of the automobile industry's most energetic promoters. By 1912, Fisher and his peers saw the same limitation. The car's future depended on the road beneath it. If America was to move forward, it needed a new kind of highway. Continuous, durable, and open to all. Fisher's idea was bold. Rather than waiting for government to act, a near impossibility under state laws that restricted public funding for such projects, he proposed a privately funded coast-to-coast rock highway. It would serve as a model for the nation, demonstrating what a true transcontinental road could look like. Later, when he gathered investors and supporters in Indianapolis, that concept became the starting point for what would soon be called the Lincoln Highway, the first great experiment in connecting America by car. From dare to action. On July 1st, 1913, a new organization quietly filed its charter in Detroit. Its name was the Lincoln Highway Association, and its purpose was spelled out in plain language: to procure the establishment of a continuous improved highway from the Atlantic to the Pacific, open to lawful traffic of all descriptions without toll charges. Behind that statement stood a group of men whose influence reached across the entire automotive industry. Carl G. Fisher had sparked the idea. Henry B. Joy, president of Packard Motor Car Company, gave it structure and prestige. Frank Seiberling of Goodyear Tire and Rubber supplied both funding and materials. John N. Willis of Overland and Edsel Ford of the Ford Motor Company joined soon after, lending their names and resources. The decision to name the road after Abraham Lincoln was as strategic as it was symbolic, transforming a business initiative into a national tribute. By invoking Lincoln's name, the association framed its mission as something larger than commerce. It was about unity, a road that would bind the nation from coast to coast. The route they envisioned stretched roughly 3,389 miles, linking Times Square in New York to Lincoln Park in San Francisco. It would cross 13 states, with an eventual 14th added as realignments evolved. At the time, much of that distance was unpaved, some of it barely qualifying as road at all. Building it outright was impossible. The association didn't have the funds, and no government agency yet existed to take it over. So the Lincoln Highway would begin as a demonstration, an object lesson that could inspire public investment. Fisher and Joy understood that visibility was their greatest weapon. If they could make America see the road, even if only in part, the idea would take hold. Trailblazers and true believers. To prove the highway could be built, the association organized a trailblazer tour in the summer of 1913. 17 cars and 2 trucks left Indianapolis in July, following a rough line west towards San Francisco. The caravan was part survey, part spectacle. Its purpose was to chart the best possible route while stirring up enthusiasm in every town it passed. They drove through mud so deep that the wheels vanished. In Iowa, entire cars had to be pulled out by teams of horses. In Utah and Nevada, sand drifts stopped them cold, forcing drivers to dig for hours under the desert sun. Axles cracked and radiators bowled over, and the drivers often slept beside their cars in open fields. Yet every breakdown became another newspaper headline, another story about Americans daring to cross their own continent by automobile. By the time the group reached San Francisco, 34 days later, the Lincoln Highway had become a national obsession. On October 31, 1913, dedication ceremonies were held simultaneously across all 13 states along the route. Bonfires burned and marching bands played. In churches from New York to California, pastors devoted their Sunday sermons to Lincoln's legacy and the promise of a new national road. It was still little more than an idea traced across maps, but that idea had caught fire. The nation that once dragged wagons through the mud was now dreaming of driving clear across America. The object lesson. By the end of 1913, enthusiasm for the Lincoln Highway was spreading faster than the road itself. Small towns along the proposed route lobbied to be included, promising to grade roads or pour gravel if only the highway would pass through their streets. Newspapers tracked every meeting of the Lincoln Highway Association, but for all the excitement, there was one persistent question. Would it ever be more than a line on a map? The association faced a reality that no amount of optimism could pave over. Money. The cost of building even a single mile of permanent hard-surfaced highway was staggering. Henry Ford, whose company stood to benefit more than anyone from better roads, refused to contribute. Ford believed the highways should be the work of government, not private business, and without him, the organization's funding drive fell well short of its original goal. Carl Fisher and Henry Joy refused to let the effort collapse, though. If they couldn't build all of it, they would build part of it perfectly. That portion would become their object lesson to the nation, a living example of how a true transcontinental highway could be constructed and maintained. To make that lesson visible, the association worked with the Portland Cement Association and local communities to pour what became known as seedling miles. These were short, high-quality stretches of concrete pavement, each just a mile long or so, placed strategically along the route. The idea was simple: show motorists, farmers, and local officials what a modern road felt like under their wheels. The results were immediate. In towns that hosted seedling miles, local governments soon began extending the pavement on their own. The lesson was taking root. A decade later, that demonstration spirit reached its peak in Lake County, Indiana, near the town of Dyer. There, in 1923, the association completed its most ambitious experiment, the ideal section of the Lincoln Highway. It was only about 1.5 miles long, but it was built to standards far beyond anything else in the country. The pavement was 10 inches thick, steel-reinforced concrete, 40 feet wide, and banked on every curve. There were guardrails on embankments, underground drainage, and even street lighting, features that wouldn't become common for another generation. Highway engineers from across the nation came to study it. It was proof that durable, safe, high-speed travel wasn't a fantasy. The ideal section became a blueprint for everything that would follow: the federal aid highway system of the 1920s, and eventually the interstates themselves. In just a few years, Fisher's object lesson had evolved from a single dream to a national movement. What began as a private crusade to inspire better roads and turned into a public expectation that America should have them. more than a line on a map. For all the speeches and blueprints, the Lincoln Highway only became real when shovels hit the ground. There was no single construction company, no federal budget, and no uniformed crew. The highway was built in the old-fashioned way, one county, one stretch, and one volunteer group at a time. Early on, the Lincoln Highway Association had no power to build directly. Its members published road guides, raised local subscriptions, and issued engineering standards, then depended on towns and states to do the work. In many places, the highway was simply an existing farm road, graded or graveled for the very first time. Where mud was the deepest, farmers with horse teams lent their time and wagons. County work gangs used steamrollers and mule scrapers and hand tampers to shape primitive beds of crushed stone and clay. When funding allowed, crews laid macadam, or concrete slabs, usually 10 feet wide and poured in sections by hand. Cement mixers were rare, and most of the early paving was completely done by hand. Steel reinforcement, a given in today's construction, was only added in major curves or near bridges. In the Midwest, the Portland Cement Association supplied both material and training, teaching local laborers how to mix proper ratios of aggregate and cement. Bridges were another frontier. Hundreds of wooden trestles were replaced with reinforced concrete arches, a new technology at the time. In Iowa and Illinois, small manufacturing plants began turning out precast culvert sections marked with LH numbers, so counties could install them without engineers on site. Every state had its challenges. In Wyoming, convicts from the state penitentiary laid gravel and dynamited boulders to carve roadbeds through the mountain passes. In Nevada, crews scraped through alkali flats, using brush and sand drifts to keep wheels from sinking. Near Salt Lake City, local volunteers famously built their segment overnight when the Trailblazer Scouts threatened to bypass them, a story retold in newspapers nationwide as proof of Lincoln Highway spirit. By the end of the decade, nearly every mile of the route existed in some usable form. Only patches remained ungraded, and these were quickly filled as automobiles multiplied. What began as 1,000 disconnected local projects had, by sheer persistence, become a continuous road. For the first time, an ordinary driver could cross the continent without leaving the public highway system. However, what came next would put this amazing road to a true test. A modern army meets an unready road. In the summer of 1919, the U.S. Army organized a cross-country motor convoy to test military mobility and modern vehicles. The route they chose, of course, the Lincoln Highway, America's most famous road at the time. Over 80 trucks and cars set out from Washington, D.C., reaching San Francisco 62 days later. The journey exposed something about this very well-published highway and how uneven America's roads still were. Bridges were collapsing under the weight of trucks. Vehicles sank into the mud and sand, and repairs were constant. One of the young officers assigned to this convoy was a lieutenant colonel by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower. He kept detailed notes of the entire experience, describing the nation's roads as inadequate to meet present-day traffic requirements. And for all the bad publicity it brought, it proved something that the Lincoln Highway Association had been saying since 1913. The nation needed a connected, modern road system. For Eisenhower, it planted an idea that would resurface decades later, when as president he championed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, also known as the birth of America's Interstate Highway System. The convoy's legacy cemented the Lincoln Highway as more than a promotional dream. It had become a testing ground for the country's future and security. The true champion of the highways finally steps forward. By the mid-1920s, the map was crowded with over 250 named roads, often overlapping and confusing to say the least. To bring order, the federal government introduced the U.S. numbered highway system in 1926. Most of the Lincoln Highway was absorbed at this point by U.S. Route 30, though many towns continue to call it by its original name. On September 1, 1928, thousands of Boy Scouts installed 2,400 concrete markers along the route, each one inscribed, "This highway dedicated to Abraham Lincoln, It was the last great act of the Lincoln Highway Association before it quietly dissolved. The Lincoln Highway's ancestral DNA is something we can still see in our roadways today, as it has lived on in the design of every major highway that followed. You may wonder what happened to the men that stood behind the highway when it began. Carl G. Fisher, often known as the Visionary, he was the vice president of the Lincoln Highway Association. Fisher remained involved till about 1916, when his attention turned to another project called the Dixie Highway, and later to a development he named Miami Beach. His fortune soared in the 1920s and was wiped out completely by the Great Depression. He died almost penniless in 1939, nearly forgotten, even though so many of our first highways in the nation bore his imprint. Henry B. Joy, known as the Persuader. Joy served as president of the LHA from 1913 all the way until 1918. He gave the road its name and its mission, then spent his later years advocating for concrete standards and federal road funding. He died in 1936, remembered as an organizer who gave Fisher's dream direction. Frank A. Seiberling, the rubber tycoon. As one of the original board members and a major benefactor, Seiberling's active years ran from 1913 to 1917, but his influence carried on through the 1920s through Goodyear's continued support for highway projects. He lived long enough to see the interstates rise, passing away in 1955 at the age of 96. John N. Willis, the manufacturer. Willis joined as a founding director in 1913 and stayed involved through the highway's formative years before returning to Willys Overland. His later career took him into diplomacy as U.S. ambassador to Poland before his sudden death in 1935. His company's later Jeep line carried his name across yet another frontier. And finally, Edsel B. Ford, the heir apparent. An active director from 1913 to 1916, Edsel's early role symbolized the automobile's next generation. His quiet support contrasted his father's skepticism, and he later reshaped Ford's identity through design and style. He died in 1943, having lived to see the automobile fully claim the nation his board once mapped. The room where the road began, a closing reflection. It started with a handful of men and a single impossible idea that a nation could be connected not by rails but by road. And in that smoke-filled room in Indianapolis, they had no idea that their big dream wasn't big enough for how far it would all reach. Carl Fisher's spark, Henry Joy's discipline, Frank Seiberling's industry, John Willys' ambition, and Edsel Ford's quiet faith each brought something the other lacked. Together they laid down more than a highway. They laid down a new way of thinking about America itself. The Lincoln Highway would outgrow them all. It would evolve, fracture, and be renamed. It would give way to US 30, then to interstates that would still follow its shadow across the plains. But the idea they lit that night never really faded. Every smooth stretch of concrete, every green sign marking a route westward, carries a trace of that movement. When a few visionaries decided the automobile deserved a road worthy of it. A century later, the line they drew on a map still runs beneath our tires. We don't notice it when we change lanes on an 8-lane freeway or pull into a rest stop in Nebraska. But the spirit of that road, the first one to truly cross America, it's still there. In 1912, Carl Fisher said, "Let's build it before we're too old to enjoy it." And they did. And in doing so, they gave every generation that followed a way to see their country, not from above and not from the train window, but from the open road. Well, we hope you enjoyed our story about the Lincoln Highway. Maybe you've got a story you'd like to share with us about the highway that's near and dear to you. If so, leave us a comment below. We're really active there, and we love to hear these tales. Also, if you like this video, if you could, go ahead and click that like button. That helps it go a lot further on YouTube. That and sharing it with other friends that you think might enjoy it. You know, we love telling stories from the roads that move us. And if that's something you enjoy, hearing those kind of histories, then why don't you join us on this caravan by subscribing to the channel? Here at Beyond the Exit, we're always looking for history hiding in plain sight. And a lot of times it's just waiting there to be rediscovered. We appreciate having you here, as always. Thanks for watching, and God bless.